So, Mark, thanks very much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Sure, nice to be here, Clark.
So, do you mind to begin with just telling me a bit about yourself, who you are, and what is it you do?
Well, I'm one of thousands of recovering journalists. Really, started life as a journalist. Worked for many years in the BBC. BBC, made a huge mistake and sent me to New York for 6 months. I made it last about 5 years, and then left and worked for sort of nonprofit media organizations in the States. Um, Spent some time in Santa Monica, but mostly in Washington, D.C. Right now, I'm teaching at Georgetown University, teaching video production and podcasting and various other things, and helping people launch, startup podcasts and startup videos and stuff.
Well, I was really wanted to talk to you obviously about podcasting and communication, but obviously you also had experience working in mainstream media, BBC and NPR. I know you've covered US elections. So one of the things we've heard recently is that this was the podcast election. What do you make of that out of interest?
I think that a key figure in the whole election drama was Barron Trump, who my son actually knows from Washington, D.C. They played FIFA together online with a group of
Wow.
friends. And so I don't think he actually met Barron, but he knew him through that grouping. And I think it was Barron who said to Donald Trump, there's this whole bunch of people out here and no one's talking to them.
Yeah.
And these are the shows that you need to get on. And these are the things you need to say. And this is the audience you'll speak to. And it's an audience that have not traditionally voted for you, but might.
Yeah.
And so, in a way, I think it's true. I think podcasting did play an outsized role in this election. And I'm kind of coming from the sort of factual end of podcasting. It's a shame for me to feel like it was the kind of political philosophical headbanging end of podcasting that really swung it. I mean, I used to commute from New York to Washington for a couple of years, and I used to listen to some of the right-wing radio talk shows. This is back in the 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah.
And it kind of reminds me of that. It's kind of guys of our age, well, my age anyway, pontificating about this and that for hours on end,
Right.
which is not my kind of podcasting, but, seems to work for politicians. So,
Yeah, it's interesting. Was it Rush Limbaugh was the name, I think, but back in the day,
yeah,
some of it's an extension of that.
yeah. And Hannity and Coombs. I'm not sure what
Hannity,
happened to
yes.
Coombs, but anyway,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, when you covered the US elections in your experience, was it as ruthless as it looked forward facing behind the scenes? Is there a bit more camaraderie, or is it as bad as it seems?
No, it was. I don't think it was as ruthless.
Yeah.
I covered Clinton's re-election, and I mean, there is always a certain camaraderie among the media, and your access to the politicians is always strictly controlled and limited. I did get an elbow in the face from one of Bob Dole's security men at one point because I got
Oh,
too
really?
close to Bob Dole. Yeah, but
Wow.
um, but we also, me and the camera guy I was working with at the time, Eric Thyra, we captured one of the most famous clips from the Bob Dole Bill Clinton election, which was when somebody said, "Do you think Bob Dole's too old, Mr. President, to be president?" And Clinton said, "It's the age of his ideas that's the problem." And
Oh,
so
wow.
we sold that all over the place. We were there for that somewhere in New Mexico, I think. So it was fun following them around. Followed them around in a bus for months on end,
Yeah.
and you feel like you're a tiny little part of a huge kind of huge mechanism. But
A much bigger thing.
it was a lot of fun. But was it politer? Was it more decent? I think so. Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, I think it's just, the dialogue has just got more and more coarse over the last 5 or 6 years, sort of coincided, I think, with the rise of social media and,
Yeah.
um, and because Trump himself isn't sort of the politest, most socially aware human being on earth.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. We are, I mean, everyone knows it now. We're living in the strange time, but we don't know how to get out of it. And I think that the social media, it seems to bring out the worst in us. I always think, I have this phrase I always use, we have these hunter-gatherer brains that evolved on the plains of Africa tens of thousands of years ago that haven't changed all that much.
Yeah.
We're incredibly flexible. And I think we're reaching our upper limits of how much communication we can have. And it just seems to make everyone a lot more angry. And politics is the kind of cesspool for it, really.
I think you're right. I think a lot of people have peaked with social
Yeah.
media. You know, a lot of people of my generation, I'm Gen X, a lot of my friends kind of like got excited about it because it's a way to keep in touch. We got
Yeah.
groups, old school pals I've reunited with, you know, old pals from college, blah, blah. There's all of that. But I think the enthusiasm for it has kind of peaked because of the amount of garbage
Yeah.
that's there. I mean, for instance, I would never now. A couple of years ago, I probably would have checked Twitter just for the news or whatever. I would not think to go there for anything now unless unless a friend was trying to get in touch with me. So,
Yeah.
so I think people have figured out. A lot of people have figured out the extent to which it's helpful,
It's useful.
and people are also becoming aware of how damaging it can be to to kids and people in people in minority situations and
Yeah.
people who are sick and that kind of thing.
Yeah. I know Jonathan Haidt, I'm a big fan of. He has a new book out, The Anxious Generation, and I've not read it, but I need to get it. And I think he's talking all about, how phones have really impacted, this younger generation times. And I actually stopped. I got hooked on X about a year or so ago, and I was very late to the uptake. I didn't really have Twitter for a long time, and my God, it gets you. It's very sticky, it kind of and recently I just kind of went full, I had to just completely get off it. And when for 5 seconds, for 5 minutes, I'll notice if I'm just start scrolling again, it takes about 2 minutes for something to make my blood boil or to something to irritate me. I'm like, I've got to put this down. It's just not a good aspect of my
No,
life.
it's a polarizing influence. So one of the things I've noticed, I've been teaching now 20 years, always part time, always alongside whatever else I was doing. One of the things I've noticed is that the students, and maybe COVID was a part of the reason for this, but the students don't look at each other in the eye.
Mm.
Unless you tell them to. They,
Wow.
it's sort of like all of the answers to mankind are buried in that box that's in front of you, that computer that's there. That's where all the answers are. That's where they all stare when they come into the classroom. And I say to them, we're gonna look at each other in the eye when we talk to each other. We're gonna nod. We're gonna empathize with each other. We're gonna let the other person know that we're listening. These are important skills.
Right. Yeah.
But it's difficult. It's difficult. All the world's answers are in that little box there, and so that's where I'm going to stare in my little safe haven. And if I want to write something nasty about somebody, they'll never know my true identity. I can just write it here and feel better about it, right?
Yeah. God, strange times. That must be strange as a communication teacher to have to go right back to basics almost.
Oh, hey, soft skills are in vogue.
Yeah.
I'm releasing a video series in the fall of just basic soft skills for late grade high school people, for college students. Basic handshake skills, eye contact skills, listening skills. Approaching male and female differently or the same or whatever. All of those kind of things, because I think they are increasingly lacking, and I see this around, in real life. I've noticed this.
Yeah.
Those kind of abilities are really lacking. But you still remember somebody who looks you in the eye and respects you, and says, "I'm interested in what you have to say."
Yeah.
It's still important. It's the way we feel good about each other. It's the way we can exchange ideas safely.
Yeah.
And so I'm worried that is getting lost in the sort of technological freak out that we're having. Yeah.
Obviously you're a Brit and you've been here a long time.
Yeah.
What's one thing, and particularly in regards to politics and the elections you've covered in your time, is the one thing that you think Brits should know about American politics that they might not, or that might not be intuitively obvious? I was just back in the UK a couple of weeks ago, and I think a lot of people are looking over the pond and thinking, what the hell's going on in this crazy place? Some of that might be reasonable, some maybe not so. What's your sense of that? Is there anything you would say that they need to understand that they might not?
Keep me, just shut me up when you've had enough of this answer, because I've got so much to say on this issue.
Oh, please.
No, You know, when I first came to the States, the funniest thing was, I was in charge of the New York bureau for the BBC, and we would get calls from London, and some of them would be from very junior producers wanting interviews with people for stories they were working on. I remember one particular woman, very, very nice woman, and she said, "We were wondering if you could just pop over to Idaho. There's this fascinating doctor who talks about menopause, and we'd love to get a little clip from him."
Mm.
And I'm like, Idaho. Okay, so that's about a 5-hour flight. If we go tomorrow, we'll be back on Friday. It'll cost you about $3,000. There'll be a hotel. And
Yeah.
she said, "Oh gosh, I never realized."
Right.
So I
Yeah.
think, the first thing that I find Brits don't understand is the sheer size of this country,
Yeah.
and the time it takes to go between, you know, between Los Angeles and Phoenix.
Yeah.
I mean, you could say Los Angeles and Santa Monica is like 10 miles, still takes 2 hours, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Particularly now.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I think that's the first thing that Brits don't grasp unless they have spent time here, a lot of time here, and
Yeah.
unless they've got away from Orlando or New York or wherever it has been and actually seen some of the countryside. It's the sheer size of the United States. And then the other thing I think is that is confusing to British people is the way that the states relate to each other. So
Mm.
that there is states politics and there is federal politics and there is local politics. And I think
Yeah.
because of the sheer complication of it, I find myself saying, well, that's a state thing. And they say, well, what do you mean it's a state thing?
Yeah.
So you're thinking Lancashire. No, no, no.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, Idaho,
Right.
um, and they have their own set of rules and they have their own state house and they have their own this and that, and education system. And and again, so it relates to size, but, I think that's one of the things that makes it hard for them to grasp the politics.
Mm.
As far as as far as the kind of alleged sort of autocratic system that we're moving into, um, I mean, I think a lot of us find that kind of hard to grasp. In the
Mm.
same way that somebody who had lived in Britain might find hard to understand as well.
Yeah.
All the idea that Democrats still can't get their heads around why Donald Trump got reelected.
Mm.
Same reason again. It's like it's like you haven't been well enough informed, even as
Right.
somebody like me, as a news junkie who reads all the papers. Like you said, you like to read the newspapers and
Yeah.
watch the cable news and whatever. Even then, there are things that we have clearly not understood about, what's happening in a lot of parts of America.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, even for me, I think recently, it was only recently I think I started to understand, and the penny dropped about the difference between the states and the federal level. And I've been here 14 years, and they are basically like mini countries. Really,
Yeah.
they have a lot more autonomy than I think Brits necessarily realize. I mean, one of the things I think as well for me is that the media operates very differently in the US, at least from when I was growing up. If you're a liberal here, you've got CNN and MSNBC, and they really are the homes you go to. And if you're a conservative, you go to Fox. And it's been like that a long time. And that was always very shocking to me when I first got here. And I think a news junkie like you, I liked watching a bit of the right wing and then the left wing. And I was someone who just got a little bit of everything. And I used to sometimes have my jaw on the floor at stuff that I was hearing on Fox, and I couldn't believe how biased it felt.
Yeah.
However,
Yeah.
I think CNN and MSNBC have increasingly become I used to think they were probably more impartial. I think they've become more increasingly the liberal end. And so you have these media machines that literally, propaganda it might be too strong, but they really do fuel a lot of the division, I think, because people are just so separate in the information they hear. And I don't think Brits maybe have a true sense necessarily of just how biased and how different the media operates over here in the US.
Right, and there have been, various attempts at kind of positional politics in the media in Britain. So there's news, what's it called, News UK or something like that.
GB News.
Yeah, when you and I, were both brought up on, good old, this is the BBC. Yeah, we're going to tell you what's happening, and you're going to listen.
Yeah.
And we know everything that's happening, so don't worry, we'll take care of you.
Right.
Yeah, and the BBC is kind of grappling around to find its identity again in the midst of all this fragmented media. And of course, there is no such thing as a BBC here. And the nearest thing to it, I guess, would be PBS, NPR. Um, but again, it's hard to explain the kind of non-profit model of those organizations to a British person, and say, well, they don't get their money from the government. Well, they do get a little bit, but they get it from the listeners. I used to go on and beg.
Right, yeah.
When I worked for the NPR station in Washington, WMU, we used to go on and beg every morning for a week.
Yeah.
248-8850, 800-248-8850. Every dollar counts. So you can give us $10, and we'll give you a mug with your name on it. And the truth of it, Clark, the worst thing of all to know was that the more you gave out the phone number, the more it rang.
Right, interesting. Yeah, yeah.
The phone number is endlessly repeated on those pledge drives, But that is how, NPR gets half its money from small donations, from people calling in and, pledging on the web. That kind of model, just, the BBC would crumble in a matter of days if it didn't rely on the license fee,
Right.
So that, there's a crucial difference there. And then when you look at cable here, okay, you've got Fox on the right. You know exactly where Fox are coming from. You've got MSNBC, the sort of Rachel Maddow kind of juggernaut on the left. And you've got CNN kind of in a similar role to the BBC saying, we're trying to be fair. We're trying to be fair. How do we be fair? And sometimes actually going too far and not asking the important questions, because they're bending over backwards to try to be fair to the Republicans right now and win Republican sympathy back, from the animosity that they have felt at CNN. And so I feel like sometimes in their effort to be impartial, they are appeasing, one side or the other.
On that note, it's interesting, we keep hearing that the mainstream media, the viewing figures across, the main traditional networks are down. I believe, CNN's ratings are much lower than they used to be, Fox, MSNBC. Do you think the traditional legacy media, can it survive in the new media landscape?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's a slow death.
Right.
If you take, just to refresh this conversation a little, maybe if we take sport, I'm looking for the golf this morning. I'm not watching on NBC or CBS. I'm watching it on an app. And then on that app, I can watch 6 different matches at the same time. Yeah. I can watch Rory McIlroy on the 10th, and I can watch, Wyndham Clark on the 15th, and I can both have them on the split screen. So I think the visual medium is moving towards, apps, derivatives, Netflix and movies and things like that. That's how people will get their news from there and from social. And then podcasting has kind of forged its own way, kind of beyond radio, kind of radio that you don't have to remember what time it is, but still radio where you can drive the car or make the coffee at the same time.
Yeah.
Which you can't do with television, there are very limited things you can multitask with television, but radio is perfect for the increasing number of multitaskers because it's just there in the background and you're listening to it. And after a while, you don't even realize you're listening to it. I had a show on last night to fall asleep to, and then I woke up this morning and I couldn't remember whether it was a show or whether it was a dream.
Oh, wow. Yeah. It's becoming an all-consuming. Yeah. Well, we can. I mean, it's very easy. I think that's part of the beauty and the allure of podcasting is you can either watch them or you can just have them on the side, and there's this always comforting voice or not so comforting, depending what you're into, that's there to talk you away.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is it used to be that there were journalists and then there was the rest of the world.
Right.
I was always very proud of the fact that I was a journalist. One of my first assignments in Liverpool, I was driving into the radio station in Liverpool one morning, and there was a bunch of police cars outside a bank. And I thought, oh, there's something going on here, so I had my new little flashy tape recorder. So I parked up the alleyway and I got out and I found, as you were trained to do, I found the police officer with the biggest number of stripes down his shoulder and the biggest hat on, And I said, "Excuse me, officer, I'm from Radio City. Can you tell me what's happening here?" Very confident,
Yeah.
And he sort of looked down at me. after a while. It was a long silence. And he said, "Listen, son, just F off."
Yeah, that's a
And
very
so,
scouse way of dealing with it as well.
yeah, I mean, then,
Yeah.
I realized then that, being a journalist wasn't really important in anybody else's eyes, And,
Right.
but now everybody is a journalist, right? You
Yeah.
are, everybody is. Anybody with a microphone, a camera, anybody who can film, anybody who can shoot on phones, we are all journalists. And so that's another nail in the coffin, I think, of the nightly news,
Right.
which is the fact that, people are getting their news now from, thousands of sources and not just the old stalwarts of the old days like Peter Jennings and Tom Brokaw.
Right. Right. Are there any lessons do you think that they can learn from new media, the legacy media, if they're to stay relevant, or do you think it's kind of on its way out and we'll move to this new kind of digital model?
I think I think they are trying to learn. I think the fact that they are still profitable is in the way because at the bottom line, as we've seen with what's going on at CBS, in their effort to appease Trump, they are willing to sacrifice their best program,
Right.
60 Minutes, because the president doesn't like it. I think that everything is, with the American networks, they still seem to be predominantly motivated by money. Clearly, the Washington Post is perhaps the last big legacy media that's surviving is the New York Times. And there's a place to look for a model. They are doing more video. They're doing more interactive. They're doing a whole slew of podcasting. The digital model is making money. People are ditching the old paper and signing on for weeks and months of computer subscription, and so I think that transformation is a real model for the others, and not just newspapers, for TV stations as well.
Yeah.
Because there's no reason why, I say to people in podcasting, I say, that script you wrote, that intro you wrote was really good. You know what? That's your show notes. That could be a blog. That could be a Substack.
Right.
That interview,
Right.
that interview you did with Clark, that could be a blog on your homepage, right? You just need to get the transcript, and transcriptions now are happen like this. All of the
Yeah.
AI models are using them. So I think even the electronic media can move to a kind of a digital world if they have the courage to do it, and if they're prepared to invest to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. You said before that, and it's so true that now anyone with a microphone and a phone can basically be a journalist, and you can potentially reach millions of people. And there's clearly, obviously everything's harder than it looks, but there's great benefit in that. But out of interest, with all your experience and insights, what are the other potential cons to that? I think we're very up on the podcast sphere world right now because it's so popular. But I mean, I know, there's a lot of controversy around, Joe Rogan, and for example, and I mean, he I don't know if you saw this. I don't want to go too deep into it, but he had two people on recently discussing and debating the, Israel-Palestine conflict, and not to go down that route, but the big conversation was, well, one of these people is a journalist, one isn't, and there are guardrails with traditional journalism that don't necessarily exist with podcasting. What are your thoughts on that, and what are the negative consequences potentially to this?
Oh yeah, because well, you with roots in the north of England will have learned probably at school about the Lancashire witches, right?
Rings a
Do you remember
bell
that?
vaguely.
The
Yeah.
Lancashire witches and Pendle Hill and all of that. So it's the story of a group of women who lived in the north of England in medieval times who used to try to invent new medicines. So they would try to invent a cure for a cold or something to soothe a wound or something like that. And the elders of the time saw all these potions and decided that these women were witches and they should be hung and drowned. And the rumor spread that these women were witches. And so everybody, all of a sudden there are thousands of people in that neighborhood who all thought that these women were witches, when in effect they were just sort of, women trying to improve the world. And so the
Right.
reason I bring this up is because I think that in some senses, social media is now a reincarnation of that story. You start a rumor and it spreads and it might be absolute nonsense, but, the stock exchange starts dropping because of the rumor. Somebody in the political administration seizes on it because it suits them, even though they know it's not true. When you said there are some guardrails with journalism, that's the problem, that there used to be guardrails for journalists. I I took a 1-year master's degree in journalism. I got a certificate from the National Council for the Training of Journalists. I was very, very pleased with it in the 80s.
Yeah.
And I was taught that, if you got your facts wrong, you were out.
Right. Yeah.
But apparently the facts don't really matter anymore. And so that's the danger with just putting this equipment and this power in the hands of people who haven't thought it through, or people who seek to influence it for their own financial or other kind of gain.
Right.
To be a real journalist, you have to be in it just to tell the truth. You have to be in it because you want to you want to inform other people of what's right or what's happening somewhere or an injustice or something.
Yeah.
There can be no other motivation really.
Right. Right.
To be a true journalist.
Yeah. Yeah. There's definitely an opportunity for a lot of bad faith actors and conspiracy theorists to wade on in this new world, that stuff is very hooky as well. There's something about that kind of grips and grabs our attention more than other things. But with so many podcasts out there, and I know you teach podcasting and you teach communication. Why should someone start a podcast this day and age when there's so much competition out there?
That's a great question. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
If you start a podcast to be famous, then good luck, unless you already are in some degree. Unless you've already achieved something in life and you're starting from a very low base and you don't have that many contacts on social media, it's a very long road up. But I've lived this now with a couple of clients of mine who I edit and help produce and publish their podcasts and help them do relaunches and things. And I've learned that if you are patient, the podcasts grow. I mean, as you probably know, most podcasts die after about 6 weeks.
Right. Yeah.
So when Libsyn or one of the fancy podcast organizations tells us that there are 3 gazillion podcasts, half of them are already dead. Because people give up, So you have to have that perseverance. So I work with a therapist, Dr. Lisa Marie Bobby. She's in Denver, Colorado. She has an organization called Growing Self. She has 300,000 weekly listeners, and
Wow.
she grew from zero, and it's taken her more than 10 years.
Oh wow! Yeah.
And that's you have to have that patience to grow. I mean, there are some tricks you can use. Get on other people's podcasts. Make sure that you publicize yourself as well as you possibly can in all your social platforms. Use images, use color, use creative writing, whatever it might be. But the most important thing for people is they've got to stick with it. I say to people, you got to make me a list before I work with you. You got to make me a list of 10 topics or 10 guests you're going to have for the first 10 weeks.
Yeah.
Because if you've got 5 topics in your head and then you run out of ideas, you shouldn't be doing this,
Yeah.
You've got to want to do this for the next couple of years at least.
Right.
And then the way to help people do that is to say, have a break. Do a series of 12, have a month off, run the best 4 during that break, run the best 4 shows.
Yeah.
That you've done already, and then do a new series, because there is a huge amount of burnout. I mean, and again, this, being relatively new, I think, podcaster or YouTuber, it takes a lot more work than you imagine.
Yes.
To do it well.
Everything's harder than it looks. Always. There's one thing I've learned. One lesson I've learned in life. Everything's harder than it looks.
Yes. Yeah. But if you have the perseverance, I think people can succeed even from a very low base, and she is a great example of that. And I have others. But the common theme through all of the ones that succeeded, it was determination and patience and perseverance.
And they just kept going in the resilience. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you'd see shows that you thought were great that got 60 viewers or 60 listeners, and then the following week 60, and then the following week 52, and you think, oh gosh, and then all of a sudden, bang, 1,000 listeners for an episode, all of a sudden, and sometimes there is no figuring it.
Yeah,
there's no figuring out why. It's just that something happened to go viral. That somebody happened to share it with somebody else, shared it with somebody else, and away it went.
It exploded.
And that's happened. I had that experience with a lot of people.
Yeah,
that same experience.
With teaching communication, and this might sound like an obvious question, but why is communication so important today? I mean, it always has been, of course, and I think probably most people have an obvious sense of why we should be able to communicate clearly. But in your experience of teaching communication, is there any kind of hidden gem or knowledge or extra thing that people that isn't so obvious as to why you should be a strong communicator?
I I teach my students to think before they decide which mode of communication to use. You know, when I was growing up, there was really only the telephone. You know, I had a girlfriend in Bristol when I was growing up in Liverpool. The only way we could communicate, we saw each other about once a month, but we were on the phone for hours, and it was intimate. We could hear each other's voices. We could talk. We could tell each other what had happened during the day. So, but there was no texting. There was no emailing. It was just the phone. You know. Bizarrely, my son likes to use the phone to talk, to have a conversation. He'll call me up and we'll chat about the football, the soccer for an hour or whatever. You know, he loves to do that. My daughter is terrified of speaking to a stranger on the phone. She's like,
Really?
Dad, you know, I couldn't pay the electricity bill. Dad, can you call them and explain?
Wow, yeah,
You know,
that's a shift.
yeah,
That's a
they're
cultural
terrified of
shift.
talking. And I think a lot of the students are really reticent to do that. And I say to them, right, before you rush into a text, which texts are easily misunderstood, they are shorthand, they don't contain all the facts, you know, unless it's somebody that you know really well and you have a very precise thing to say, don't use text, you know.
Yeah,
So that's number one. So let's think about what's the best way to talk to this person? Is it text? Is it email? Is it phone? And think about that person and how they want to receive the message. I remember an old girlfriend saying to me when she broke up with me, she said, if you know, it's not the way you say it, it's the way I receive it that matters.
mm,
And I learned from that
yeah,
because what she's saying is, you know, could I please try to talk in the sort of language that might resonate with her? You know, and so I
interesting.
think the secret to communication is to think about the person that you're communicating with, and try to meet their mind, if you like, so that you are best understood.
Yeah,
And then subsequently you can understand them. And so if it's not text, it could be email, it could be phone, it could be visual like this, it could be FaceTime. But
right.
we've got all these choices that we didn't used to have, and I think we're making a mess of it, you know?
Yeah, interesting.
You
Yeah.
know, because texts, you know, well, I got this text and it's not, he said it wasn't what he meant. And, you know, please, you know.
Yeah, I remember, it's so, I kind of forgot I had this experience, but when I was about 12 years old, so I was very young, there was a girl I kind of fancied, who was about my age, and it's a different school, and somehow I got her phone number. I think a friend of a friend got the phone number, and it was all kind of innocent, and I had to call her up, and the dad answered, and her name was Sarah. Sarah, there's a boy on the phone for you. And he was very nice. And I was mortified, but I was so nervous. But we had this call and we spoke for God knows what the hell we spoke about, but I got through it.
Yeah.
And I don't think I ever met her, but I had the courage to call up this girl and we took the call and we had a little chat. And that was kind of like a rite of passage in a way. It was the
Yes.
social interaction, it was the ability to communicate, it was having the guts to do it and the nerves. And there's now this generation who aren't going through those kind of rites of passage. And as innocent and as sweet and as silly as it was actually quite an important part for all the other stuff that would come later in how
Yeah.
to interact
Yes.
with other people.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, I mean, COVID gets the blame for a lot of things, but, you
Mm.
know, again, I think it did sort of change people's kind of attitude. There's a lot more shyness around, I notice, in the student bodies that I work with. Um, but, you know, essentially, I think those sort of skills, and that having the courage to make that phone call that you made, you know, really
Yeah.
important things, and that's why you've remembered it because it
Right.
was it was a big deal at the time, you know, and you felt good about it.
It's interesting. What do we lose if we lose those experiences? I guess that's
Yeah,
interesting. Who knows?
yeah.
Um, I guess my final question for you really is you've been here for a long time in the US. What do you miss about the UK? What do you miss most about the UK, and what do you love most about America? Because I think America gets a bad rap a lot of the time, and there's a lot of craziness, and we've touched on, but there are a lot of great things as well.
Yeah, well, I miss going to Anfield. There's no doubt about that. I went to
Yeah,
Anfield with my father for years and years, you know,
yeah,
to watch Liverpool, in the glory years of Liverpool when they won everything inside in the 70s and 80s. I was very fortunate to grow up in that time, in that place.
Yeah.
I miss that. We were having a conversation the other day at Georgetown, and the teaching staff, about there's a Korean teacher, and she was talking about this wonderful Korean deli that's opened up in Washington, and that you can get all this wonderful Korean food. And it made me thinking. It started me thinking about the little British shops that you used to find. I don't know if you still do. There was one out here in Virginia with a big Union Jack outside. And it's called the British Store, and it was full of sad British people looking for Cadbury's chocolate and Mr. Kipling apple pies. And
oh, that's funny.
And of course, I came away with a handful of stuff. There was like meat. You can't get good meat pies in America.
Right,
like
sausage rolls,
the steak pies, the sausage rolls. Mr. Kipling apple pies. Oh gosh, yeah,
I miss that stuff.
Irish bacon.
Yeah,
proper Irish bacon.
We have one of those in Santa Monica. It's called the Ye Old English. God, I don't even mess it up. But there's one in Santa Monica.
Yeah,
and they've actually got a pub next door. And I was there last week, actually. Yeah, sausage rolls, Marmite, all the Cadbury's chocolate. But it's all, it's expensive, but it's a good little treat every now and again.
Yeah, I think that's what I miss. I mean, the one thing I don't miss is the sort of slight sense of Schadenfreude. I mean, I think Brits are overexposed to Americans. There's way too much American culture in Britain, and I think there's a certain cynicism. I noticed this mostly in the BBC. We covered one of the early operations. This is 20 years ago, but it was a woman who was having an implant because she was suffering from Parkinson's disease, and it was the Kansas City Medical Center Hospital, and it was the most incredible movie that it was like a little news story. Called it a movie. It was like 6 minutes, ran on Newsnight, the BBC sort of late night current affairs show. Yeah. And one of the producers called me afterwards and said, look, you're in New York. What we want is more stories about fat people with guns. That's what we want. Can you go? I mean, there's all this sort of science stuff. It's great. But can you do fat people with guns?
Wow.
And so there was a sort of a certain attitude that we really wanted, we wanted our reporting to reflect our own prejudices about what the USA was like,
Interesting.
Which I didn't like, and was one of the reasons why I left in the end.
Wow, yeah. I don't know if much has changed. Maybe it has, hopefully.
I don't know. I think it's worse now.
It probably is worse. It's probably worse. Mark, thanks very much. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today. That was great.
This has been great. It's been great fun, Clark. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. Perfect. Appreciate it. Is there anything else that is important to share that you like to mention? Is there any other ideas?
You can always put my website out there somewhere. That'd be great. Because I'm still looking for clients. I'm going to need new clients in the fall. So I major on like starting, podcast startups basically for small businesses. This is my major thing.
Yeah.
So YouTube or audio or both.
Great.